All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So first of all, thank you all for being here today with us, joining us for our lunch and learn about Longleaf Pine Savanna. For those of you who might not be familiar, Trees Atlanta's mission is to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forest by planting, conserving, and educating. Once again, welcome in. We encourage you to ask as many questions as you'd like. You can use the button at the bottom of the Zoom window, or you can just submit them in the chat. We're going to answer and discuss all the questions live at the end. And if you have any other further questions, you can always email us and we'd be happy to answer them. And at the end of the Zoom, you're going to get a survey. We'd really like for you to fill that out so we can continue to improve our events and improve your experience with us. And if you aren't aware, we have different newsletters that you can sign up for. To learn about our upcoming events and opportunities, we have a volunteer newsletter, we have adult education newsletters, and a youth education one. And here's our social media platforms if you'd like to follow us to stay up to date with everything. We have a Facebook, an Instagram, and a Twitter. And then we have an annual tree sale coming up on Saturday, October 8th at the Carter Center. So we'd love for you guys to come down, or you can volunteer with us to help out with the sale. Or you can just shop with us, and we're going to be offering a variety of trees and plants focusing on dry upland species that adapt well to climate change and species that are drought tolerant. And if you didn't know, Trees Atlanta, we are going to be moving locations near the end of November towards the west side of the BeltLine, and our new address is going to be 825 Warner Street, Atlanta. So we are very excited about that. And there's just a map view and then a sketch of what the building is going to look like. And then without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sam Cartin, our BeltLine Arboretum Coordinator, who will be talking about Longleaf Pine Savannas.
Thank you, Rhus, so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, and once again, thank you all so much for showing up. Education is honestly probably my favorite aspect of the work that I do here with Trees Atlanta. For those of you who aren't familiar, I am the BeltLine Arboretum Coordinator. I've been working on the BeltLine for about 3 years. So the BeltLine has contracted us at Trees Atlanta to facilitate native species restoration all along the BeltLine corridor. And of course, I'll dive into that. But for now, I want to give you guys a rough outline to what I want to talk about in this presentation. First, we're going to talk about habitat restoration in the BeltLine Arboretum. Once again, why we do it, the ecological value. And then we're going to talk about the main point of this conversation is going to be the Longleaf Pine Savanna ecosystem, the importance of the great biodiversity of that ecosystem, the fire-adapted nature of that ecosystem. I'm going to talk a little bit more about further conservation efforts. I'm going to talk to you guys about the restoration project at Berry College, really fascinating project, and a talk I heard from one of the professors there. And then I'm going to tie that into the work that I do on the BeltLine by linking in our Longleaf Pine Savanna Arboretum space located behind Beston Brewing in the Weston neighborhood. Really cool space. And then of course, wouldn't be a Trees Atlanta presentation without a shameless plug for our Trees Atlanta fall sale, our tree sale. And I'm going to talk about the plants that you can find at that tree sale that are actually in the Arboretum space and the shrub beds surrounding the Longleaf Pines and the Longleaf Pine itself. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to get going. Important question to answer just to give context to the work that we do. Why is habitat restoration important? Why is it important? Why do we remove invasive species? Why do we plant native? Wonderful question, and in short, the answer is because native plant species bolster insect population. You can see over here on the right, I have a graph that I lifted from a Doug Tallamy lecture. For those of you who aren't familiar with Doug Tallamy, he's basically the guy in linking native species to insect population, the importance therein. And you can see over here, this bar on the left, this shows the biomass of insects found in a native hedge compared to the biomass of insects over here on the right in an invaded hedge. So what I mean by a native hedge and an invaded hedge, over here on the right, down here on the bottom, this is Chinese privet. But any of you have ever volunteered with our forest restoration department, you're very familiar. you've driven anywhere in Atlanta, you've probably seen Chinese privet. Originally, it was used as an ornamental hedge. It's evergreen, very durable. If you want those nice boxy hedges, then that's more or less the reason why it was spread everywhere. It is become an invasive species. Birds eat the berries and they spread it to the point where this species outcompetes a lot of native species. That's poster child for what an invasive hedge species is compared to up top. We have a picture I took on the Beltline, in fact, two great examples of a native hedge species. Up top, we have Virginia sweetspire, great at supporting pollinators, as well as Beautyberry here, which you can see a tiger swallowtail is pollinating. And the significant reason why that is, not only do insects prefer generally the flowers of native species, but it deals with the specialization of insects. A lot of plants, of course, they don't want to be eaten. Plants develop very specific phytochemical defenses to stop insects from eating them. So generally the rule is, especially caterpillars, are going to be able to eat native species much more than species that are coming in from another region. And that links us to why we see that massive drop off in insect biomass. So why is that a bad thing? You know, a lot of people will tell me, jokingly, hopefully, but they'll say, I don't really care about the bees. I don't really care about worms. Why does that matter to me? It does matter. And the reason is when we see these dismal headlines, like here's one from The Guardian. Insect apocalypse poses risk to all life on Earth, conservationists warn. Article from Deutsche Welle, why biodiversity loss hurts humans as much as climate change. Down here, an NPR article, North America has lost 3 billion birds, scientists say. All of these headlines are linked to the displacement of native species by invasive species. Of course, there's so many factors at play, but the thing about native species restoration, this is one of the most immediate things that we can have a positive impact on. All right, moving on. So this is a great example of the work that we do. This is a picture taken from the Lawton Street Bridge that goes over the Beltline in the West End neighborhood, kind of in between West End and Oakland City neighborhood. This was taken 10 years ago, and you can see anyone who lives in Georgia knows what this is. This is kudzu. This is what kudzu does. Once again, kudzu is another poster child for what an invasive species does, why it goes wrong. And the reason why we find kudzu so intense right here is because the Beltline, for those of you who aren't familiar, used to be a rail line. All along rail lines and transportation lines, you see kudzu spread because the government agencies between the Department of Transportation and the Soil Conservation Service, etc., spread kudzu and other invasive species, primarily to control erosion around these developed zones. And sure, yeah, these invasive species do a pretty good job at stopping erosion really quick. But as we discussed earlier, there's significant ecological ramifications. So what we have done with the Beltline, or contracted by the Beltline, is turned this blob of green into a mosaic of biological biodiversity, tree species, native tree species, meadow species, wildflowers. So I'd like to break down these 3 different pictures that I took on the Beltline, starting from left to right. This picture on the left was actually taken, I'm going to skip back, right where this big blob is. You can see what the blob actually is. It's a water oak that's just getting strangled by kudzu. And right on the other side of that water oak, I took this photo. Of course, obviously you can see it free from any kudzu. And this is a goldfinch. One of my favorite things to do in early summer is watch goldfinches feasting on the seed heads of the wildflowers that we sow as part of our native species restoration regimen. This is a wild bergamot, is the common name for this flower species. You can see a last remnant of that lavender flower. And in the foreground, we have echinacea being pollinated by one of Georgia's many bumblebee species. Over here on the right, this is actually the same area, but from a different angle, generally the same time of year. We have lots of those wild bergamot flowers that not only are extremely beautiful just to walk and enjoy, but have significant ecological function, whether it be the pollinators that enjoy the nectar, or the birds that enjoy the seeds of these wildflowers, or the caterpillars that need these specific plants to eat. They can't just eat any old plant. A great example of that right here in the middle, just a really great symbol or encapsulation of what we do, why we do it. This is a catalpa worm munching away at, you can see a catalpa leaf, the southern catalpa, wonderful tree. I call it my favorite bean tree, if you've ever seen the seed pods. And it's a nice little piece of karma going on right here. You can see the caterpillar is more or less acting as a parasite on this tree. This is one of the only tree species that this caterpillar can actually eat the leaves of. And it does a good job of tearing, just defoliating this tree sometimes. But you can see all along this caterpillar's body, a parasitic wasp has come along, laid its eggs on the caterpillar, and this caterpillar is more or less being eaten from the inside out. So it's a nice little parasite of the parasite action we have going on here. A really good symbol, again, of that biodiversity we can cultivate by removing invasive species and planting native species, a mix of flowers, trees, different habitats. All right, that leads us into, once again, the main point of this conversation is talking about the Longleaf Pine Savanna ecosystem and the importance of its conservation. So you can see right here on the right, the nature of a savanna, it's going to be a balance of these tall, overstory trees, but spaced out enough to where you have enough sunlight hitting the floor where you can have the next generation of trees growing, but also grass species, or wildflower species, a great diversity on the forest floor, as opposed to just an umbrella completely shutting down any sunlight that could potentially hit the floor. So according to AmericanForest.org, the Longleaf Pine ecosystem is home to 29 threatened or endangered species and houses over 900 unique plant and animal species. So just to emphasize, this is one of the most biodiverse ecosystems we have in the continental United States. Once again, coming from its savanna nature, that balance of the overstory trees with the meadow species. This ecosystem is dependent on semi-frequent fires once every few years. These fires cycle nutrients by clearing underbrush and preventing fire-vulnerable hardwoods from dominating the canopy. So, interesting thing about the longleaf pine itself, it's a fire-adapted species. It loves getting burned once every few years. It gets rid of competition, and once again cycles those nutrients. It can handle it a lot better than oak species generally, or other hardwoods like sweet gum that might just take over this canopy if there were no fires. So once again, that open canopy structure allows for a mosaic nature of this ecosystem, allowing for different microhabitats such as bogs and tallgrass meadows. We'll talk a little bit more about bogs that you might find in this ecosystem a little later. So habitat loss, unfortunately, is one of the main things we have to talk about when discussing the longleaf pine savanna ecosystem. Once spread about 90 million acres, as you can see on this map, from East Texas down to Central Florida up to Southern Virginia, primarily in the coastal plain regions. You can almost see the coastal plain region begin in Georgia, where this ecosystem extends up into, but it does have a good extent of population into the Piedmont region. It's not just a coastal plain species. So once again, those 90 million acres estimated to be its original old growth range, down now to less than 5%, primarily due to a lot of factors like turpentine harvesting. You can see here, harvesting the sap, and of course there's general logging over here on the left has decimated a lot of the population. A lot of these old growth longleaf pine ecosystems were replaced with other species of pine that I think pine plantations found to be favorable for various reasons. And we're once again discussing how this is a fire adapted bioadaptive species, a bioadaptive ecosystem. The demonization, more or less, of fires, characterized down here by everyone's favorite cartoon berry, Smokey the Bear. The demonization of fires has led to a significant depletion of this ecosystem because, once again, without fires, hardwoods will creep back in and take over and turn what would be an open canopy into a closed canopy, preventing a lot of the light from reaching the forest floor and diminishing biodiversity. All right, so earlier this month, I attended a talk at Trees Atlanta's headquarters by Dr. Martin Cipollini, the professor of biology at Berry College, one of the best college campuses in the country. For those of you who aren't familiar, a short drive from Atlanta, up 75, maybe an hour. Berry is doing a great job at restoring some of these Piedmont region longleaf pine populations. And just with 10 years of their management, which you can see here up top, the picture, one of the students burning, doing prescribed burns, of course, very careful. They're not just throwing a flamethrower out there willy-nilly. They're being very careful and concise with their prescription. They've gotten great results, which you can see the data here. I borrowed from a presentation. Down here at the bottom, you can see the full presentation from Dr. Cipollini at berrylongleaf.com. Does a great job of what I'm talking about now, but much more in depth, of course. Highly recommend. And these results are really impressive. You can see after a decade of management, the herbaceous plants and grasses increased from 14 individual species, mostly shade tolerant, to 130 to 170 different species. Bird abundance increased about 50% in these managed areas, once again managed with these prescribed burns. Community shifted from ground feeding, canopy nesting omnivores to foliage feeding, ground and shrub nesting insectivores, or seed fruit eaters. Remember how we're talking about fire opens up the forest floor, that allows these ground and shrub nesting insectivores, these birds, to come back in. Reptile and amphibian diversity is much higher in managed areas versus unmanaged areas, and the community has shifted towards species adapted to dry, sunny conditions. Really, really great presentation. Once again, more information can be found at berrylongleaf.com. If you're interested in other nonprofits that are doing similar restoration efforts, you can look into the Longleaf Alliance at longleafalliance.org, America's Longleaf, very comparable. I think that's just americaslongleaf.org. And then the Nature Conservancy, a much more broad nonprofit, and they got a very simple website, nature.org. Hard to forget that one. All right, and that leads us back into my role on the BeltLine. So you can see these are two pictures taken of our Longleaf Pine Savanna Arboretum space. Over here on the left, you can see me taking one of my volunteer groups. I love this space, not only for the regeneration of these species, but I think the primary function is going to be the education, the visual, hands-on education. You can see these species, how well they work together. And not only are they very visually stunning, but it allows us, once again, just to increase the biodiversity of our BeltLine Arboretum as well. And for those of you who aren't familiar, what I mean by Arboretum space, all along the BeltLine is going to be the Atlanta BeltLine Arboretum, so basically a tree museum. And an Arboretum space is going to be one of various focal points all along the BeltLine that highlight different ecosystems like this, or maybe different planting types, different microhabitats. And you can see this space itself, the centerpiece is going to be two bogs that you can see here and on the other side of this walkway. And they're going to be bordered on either side of the trail by two shrub beds where we have about 20 longleaf pines. You can see here. One of my favorite things about these two pictures, they were taken about a year apart exactly. Over here on the right, you can see this was taken in 2021, whereas this longleaf pine that was planted in about 2020, that's a good 7 feet tall, very upright. But you can see the same tree over here, if you follow my mouse, you can see how it's branched out and gained height pretty significantly. These are fast growing trees. Pines in general are going to be pretty fast growing. But for those of you who aren't familiar, this space is going to be located once again in that West End neighborhood, kind of in between West End and Oakland City, behind Best End Brewing, Gold's Kombucha, and the Lee and White development. A really great spot if you like the Beltline, but maybe prefer it a little less crowded as well. So a little more about the bog, more or less the focal point of these ecosystems, or of this arboretum space rather. Very fascinating carnivorous plants. You can see it over here on the left, the carnivore trait in action. So this is the Sarracenia genus. These pitcher plants are all in the Sarracenia genus. And the way that they trap their food is they secrete sugars around the lip, around the edge of this pitcher. It draws in these insects. You can see the flies having a feast. A lot of the times these insects, flies, bees, other insects, even hornets, wasps. I've read even some small lizards will get trapped in here. They'll go down, maybe looking for another feast. They get trapped. The inside's very hard for these insects to climb up, and it's hard for them to fly out because you can see the hood structure of these carnivorous plants. They prevent these insects from flying straight up out. They have these tiny little hairs that almost push the insect back down. Whereas if you look this time of year, but even later into fall, you like peek in and you look down inside these pitchers, they'll be filled almost to the brim sometimes with these dead insects. They fill up a little bit with water, and then the decaying insects more or less fertilize these plants. Why did these plants choose violence, you might ask? It's because they evolved generally in very nutrient poor ecosystems, nutrient poor environments, boggy, wet areas where there's not a lot of readily available nutrients. So these guys, they're very fascinating adaptation just to get those nutrients from insects that it traps. And as you can see, right and left, we have two different species, not only to provide that nice contrast in color, but also to provide blooms more throughout the season at different times. You can see here in the middle, this is my wonderful coworker, Tiffany, who I'm sure really enjoyed me adding her to this presentation. You can see this is a low-lying area that we irrigate. We make sure it's constantly moist. We amended this soil with literally a ton of peat and sand to cultivate that constantly moist environment. And it does require not only the annual burning. This is the only area throughout the Beltline in which we are permitted to do controlled burn. I have a little propane tank and a blowtorch. Very satisfying, but I am very careful, of course, whenever you're working with prescribed burns, you need to make sure that your perimeter is clear, that the fire can escape. And of course, I have running water on hand and even buckets of water just in case I need to douse anything that accidentally catches flame. But this space does, require a good bit of hand weeding. We don't we don't spray in this low-lying bog area like we might in other locations. All right, so on to my favorite part of the presentation. I get to talk about the different plants that you have an opportunity to buy at our plant sale. And these are plants that are going to be found once again in those shrub beds around the longleaf pines in this arboretum space. So lots of hands-on experience working with these plants, as well as a good bit of pictures. You can see over here on the left, this is actually a picture I took of a buttonbush, and we'll talk about that shortly. Of course, up front, we have to talk about the longleaf pine, Pinus palustrus, up for grabs at our tree sale. Over here on the left, I provided a picture just to show it in its natural environment. We're going to be selling this tree, I want to say, at a 3-gallon size. So more or less, it's going to be like one of these trees that you see in its bottle brush phase. You can see it almost looks like a pipe cleaner. Very upright. When it's even smaller, sometimes people will mistake it for a certain species of grass. And over here on the right, I chose this picture because it does a good job of highlighting what the tree not only will look like maybe a few years down the line from being planted, but it incorporates it into conventional landscaping, and you can see it's a very visually stunning specimen at this size. It is worth noting that this tree species does get upwards of 100 feet tall at mature height. You might be waiting a little while for it to get 100 feet tall. But I will say, if you are planting this tree, make sure that you plant it high. This tree prefers well-drained soil. Wouldn't even hurt you to maybe amend the soil slightly, the sand, promote that good drainage. And I would put it in a sunny spot, as much sun as you can give it. But as you can see, a very visually stunning tree that has a native range in this Piedmont region. Another shrub species that we have in our arboretum space is Shining Sumac. And you can see right now it's going to be getting that very visually stunning fall color. It goes dormant, of course. But in the summer, one of my favorite things to do is to stalk bees. And the flowers of this sumac are literally buzzing with, I'm sure one of these flower heads at a time easily hosts a few dozen different bees, native bees, different size, other pollinators, absolutely swarming with pollinators. And one other important thing to consider about this tree, it has what we call a colonial nature, similar to quaking aspen, if anyone's familiar, the Rocky Mountain species. So what I mean by that is you might look from a distance, this picture on the left, this might look like, you know, a dozen or so different individual trees. But what we have really going on is one organism that sends out runners and new growth that might, you know, appear to be a different species, but it's more or less the same organism again. So put this in a space if you get it. It can handle a little bit of shade, but put it in a space where you don't mind it branching out, so to speak. One of my favorites, again, that I mentioned earlier, Cephalanthus occidentalis, buttonbush. One of the best plants that you can plant if you're trying to have a butterfly garden. Long bloom period on these really unique looking flowers, and extremely, extremely efficient at bringing in pollinators of all different kinds, but specifically butterflies. I've noticed swallowtail butterflies love these flowers. And this is, once again, a picture I took in my own backyard. I have a bioswale rain garden in my backyard. This is a plant that grows very well in almost any condition, more or less. It will grow in boggy conditions, well-drained soil. It will grow in full sun. It'll grow even in almost heavy shade. One of the more durable plants we have up for grabs. Up next, we have Bayberry. Wax myrtle, sometimes it's known. This is going to be an evergreen. It's going to be a shrub species. Doesn't get too tall. I think maybe 15 feet, maybe 20. But once again, evergreen, and has these nice berries that, you know, have a nice visually stunning appeal, but also do a pretty good job at attracting different birds. One of my favorite aspects of this tree is crush up the leaves and smell it. It almost smells like bay leaf. I have read that there are culinary uses of this leaf, the dried leaf, as a spice, and a very, very lovely smell. And once again, a good evergreen shrubby tree to have in your landscape. Everyone loves evergreens. Up next, we have Callicarpa americana, American Beautyberry. One species that I seem to almost always get questions about when I'm leading tours or walks. When these berries arrived, you could see obviously where it got its name from. These visually stunning, bright pink berries. And if you recall the picture I showed you earlier in the presentation, it has a nice light pink flower in the summertime that, of course, give way to these berries in the fall. Right now, this is what the plant is going to look like. It's going to be deciduous. This is not going to be evergreen. It's going to drop its leaves. And it is a plant that I would recommend putting in more sun. It can tolerate shade. It's an understory shrub, but with these understory species, or, you know, a general rule when you're trying to figure out where you want to put a plant, the more sun you give a plant, the more visually appealing and shrubby the growth is going to be. Sometimes I've seen this plant in a shaded area and it has more of a leggy, unattractive appearance. some people might not care, but if you are planting this for the visual appeal, put it in some sun, it'll be a lot happier. And once again, not only are the flowers great at attracting pollinators, these berries are really good at attracting mockingbirds, catbirds in the fall, even into the winter. Sambucus canadensis, elderberry. This is another, is it a tree, is it a shrub? Another option we have up for grabs. Very aggressive growth, but rewards you with, if you are, happen to be an herbalist, the flowers themselves have lots of applications, and then the berries, of course, even with the past few years with COVID, the berries have been exploding in popularity for their immune boosting properties. But of course, this is a berry that you need to process. You can't eat this raw. This plant in general has a visual appeal, but I will say this is a plant that you probably should coppice every few years. And what I mean by that, even cutting it down to the ground will promote more of a well-rounded shrubby growth. This is a very aggressive growing plant. It grows very fast as it is an evergreen, but even on top of that, it grows pretty fast in its own right. And I have had experience with some plant owners not enjoying the aggressive nature of its growth. So put this almost anywhere, full sun, full shade, dry, wet soil environment, but primarily put this in an area where you don't mind it, growing pretty aggressively. Yucca filamentosa, another one of my favorites that can grow in a great diversity of lighting conditions, but I will say make sure that this has well-drained soil. Really, really fascinating flowers you can see over here on the right. These flower stalks get taller than I am, probably about 8 feet tall. And when they're just emerging from the basal growth, they almost look like giant asparagus. Really, really fascinating. As you might guess from the common name, Adam's needle, this plant will poke you. So maybe that might be appealing for certain locations, but have that in mind. An evergreen plant, I actually have this in my own backyard growing naturally. It grows on the forest floor naturally in a heavy shade, but it can also thrive in full sun. I will say, be patient if you're changing the lighting conditions of this plant. Likely when you're getting this from a plant sale, it's going to be in very, very, manicured conditions, lots of sun, lots of water, lots of fertilization. And I have experience putting this plant in shade and having it kind of take a step back. When you're changing, again, the light conditions, plants can, well, not get stunted, but slow down. So just be patient with this plant if you put it in shade, but it is a plant that will grow in almost any light condition. All right, once again, giving you guys information for our 23rd annual tree sale back in person at the Carter Center. More information about the plant list can be found on our Trees Atlanta website. A great diversity of tree species. And once again, we do have an additional sale in the springtime that's going to be more centered around the herbaceous plants, wildflowers, even some more shrubs. But just to emphasize, fall and winter is the best time to plant your trees, whereas spring, those herbaceous plants might be a little more flexible. For those of you who might be interested in getting involved for volunteer opportunities, once again, all that information is available at treesatlanta.org. Opportunities volunteering range from tree planting and maintenance to hands-on habitat restoration with me. We have a fun time. And without further ado, I think that leads us to our Q&A segment. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat function.
So we do have one question already, and this was about some flowers that you took a picture of along the BeltLine. Someone was wondering if native bumblebees are good pollinators for those flowers.
I have read generally bees are going to be more efficient pollinators than, say, like a butterfly, and it kind of makes a lot of sense when you observe a bee pollinating something. A lot of the times you see like the bee will wear the pollen all over itself. It's a lot fuzzier than, say, a butterfly who's a little more surgical. It sticks its proboscis in, okay, and then flies away. Butterflies don't, I don't think, catch and store as much pollen compared to bees, but of course it's very general, and I'm not particularly an entomologist to give you the official answer, but I think common sense, yeah, bees are going to be more effective pollinators than other pollinating species. Oh, I'm sorry, I think you're muted.
And then we have another question. Are any of these plants indoor plants or patio plants? Probably talking about the tree sale plants that you're referring to at the end.
I have seen yucca as a potted plant. Once again, I'm going to go back. Potted plant, once again, make sure it doesn't dry out. That's the trick of having a potted plant. I don't think any of these other shrub species that I've mentioned are going to be viable in a patio setting, unfortunately. Unless you have like a larger raised bed, potentially, then I think you could probably get away with more or less any of those species. But I would, in terms of houseplant, I don't think I've ever experienced any of those species grown as a houseplant, unfortunately.
All right, well, if there are no more questions, just remember that you're always welcome to email education@treesatlanta.org with any of your questions. And then another reminder that you're going to get a survey popping up at the end of this Zoom call. And if you could just fill that out, that would be awesome. And while I was going over that, we did get another question. When is the best time to move a deciduous plant or tree? That's a good question.
I'd definitely say dead of winter, you know, far enough into winter to where the tree has lost all of its leaves completely, maybe even had a month to kind of go fully dormant. But of course, you don't want to go too close to spring. I would just say January, February. Once again, the reason why we like to plant in the winter is because not only is it cooler, and planting in the summer, you're stressing out the plant, making it more vulnerable to drying out, but you want to give that plant enough time to set its roots down, more or less.
Well, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Sam, for your time today. That was really informative, so thank you so much. And we hope to see you guys at future Trees Atlanta events and our tree sale on October 8th at the Carter Center.
Thank you for helping, Reed.
Yeah, thank you all.